I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report. Let's check in with Stacy, see what's going on. Stacy.
Hey, what do you think the topic might be? I'm wearing a clue.
Van Gogh's paintings as he slowly went insane, eating his own paint in the field somewhere in the south of France while creating unsung masterpieces that would eventually sell for hundreds of billions of dollars thanks to fiat money printing?
No, this is actually Andy Warhol print, but the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vest, that's in our conversation.
Just like Gilets jaunes meets Chanel. It's like Gilets jaunes Chanel. It's very chic. It's just chic. It's Gilets jaunes.
You know, we sit on the brink of more revolution, maybe perhaps a French spring or a French winter. This is 10 years after the financial collapse, whereby all of our governments around certainly the Western world and the central banks came together and determined that there was no cost that they would not bear to bail out the bankers. So now everybody's quite concerned about the fact that the blowback has come, finally after 10 years, is all the ordinary people, the bottom 99% who did not benefit from the money printing, they're starting to do a nod, quite similar to what you're doing. It's like they're on to their rulers and they're angry. Well, apparently the cost to appease them is too high. Macron's concessions set to blow out French deficit. France is on course to overshoot the European Union's budget deficit ceiling next year without new spending cuts after President Emmanuel Macron caved in to anti-government street protests. Macron announced wage increases for the poorest workers and a tax cut for most pensioners on Monday to diffuse discontent, leaving his government scrambling to come up with extra budget savings or risk blowing through the EU's 3% of GDP limit.
Well, let's reel back a little bit. Okay, 2008 crisis. It was a victimless crime, we were told, and that they were going to bail out the bankers, and they spent globally something like $16, $17 trillion to do so, and now we have the blowback of that event, and the crisis never ended. It just was kicked down the road, and now it's being blowing out to the global insurrection against banker occupation, or GIABO, something we've been talking about for 10 years. It's now going global. The Gilets jaunes, the yellow vest movement, will go global. We'll see it all over the world. This is the Occupy Wall Street times 1,000. But let's talk about, what we've been saying over the years and why this is true. The way that the economy works globally, if you take a monetarist school, and that is the world we live in under neoliberalism, the global central banks find an interest rate that is appropriate to reward savers and to make credit creation possible enough to create new businesses, to create jobs and tax revenue to pay down deficits. And that naturalized rate of return tends to be around 4 or 5%. What happened in the 2008 crisis is that central banks got together and said, wait a minute, our friends, the bankers, need to get bailed out. The only way we can do that is if we artificially drop rates down to zero, near to zero, and effectively move all the money that's in pensions, all the money that's in savings, all the money that's in the pockets of workers, and we transfer it via this transfer mechanism of interest rate manipulation to our banking friends. They'll get bailed out. We bail out the creditors, but the rest of the world will have to pay. The rest of the world didn't really understand what's going on because they don't understand we live in this monetarist world. Well, 10 years later now, they are seeing the results. Inflation's creeping in, the cost of living is going higher than they can possibly afford, and they are now insurrecting all over the world. But let's talk about why this is true. Macron's a banker. He was put in there by the banking establishment to create the scenario to allow for this interest rate apartheid to continue. We all live in the Bantustan of artificially low rates for them, high rates for us, and now it's Gilets jaunes. It's game on.
So in the second half, you're talking to Michael Hudson. He's written a new book about debt. Another person who's written a book about debt is David Graeber, and he's also looked at the situation going on in the Gilets jaunes and the absence of the understanding and imagination of the elite class, the people who are supposed to be the intellectuals, who are supposed to explain this situation to us. Of course, what they are explaining, they're blaming Russia, of course, for the Gilets jaunes protest movement. But here he's saying the yellow vests show how much the ground moves under our feet. If one feature of the truly revolutionary moment is the complete failure of conventional categories to describe what's happening around us, then that's a pretty good sign we're living in revolutionary times. He goes into two explanations for what we're seeing there. But the one I want to point to is the Cantillon effect, because he he sees that. He sees what is going on in the France and the Gilets jaunes in the yellow vest is about the Cantillon effect. You and I have covered this, and you've just touched on that, which is the central banks printing money. He said, in a financialized economy, only those closest to the means of money creation, essentially investors and professional managerial classes, are in a position to employ the language of universalism. As a result, any political claims as based on particular needs and interests tend to be treated as manifestation of identity politics, and in the case of the social base of the Gilets jaunes, therefore, cannot be imagined as anything but proto-fascist. So the intellectuals look at this. Rachel Maddow sorts will look at this. Their benefits of the free money that comes from the Fed into Manhattan. She lives in Manhattan. She's paid by bankers, essentially, because the ads taken out against her program and the military-industrial complex, the Lockheed Martin and Raytheon taking out ads against her thing. So they look at these people, and what you see is they blame Russia, and they call them fascists, and you'll see that online. But I'm going to go in a little bit more once you respond to that about the Cantillon effect, and he actually puts it down to 1971, going off the gold standard.
The 5 richest zip codes in America surround America's central bank. That's a direct evidence of a Cantillon effect. They print the money. It goes to those guys in the neighborhood first. Why is Jeff Bezos moving into that neighborhood? Because he wants to get the Cantillon effect. 150 billion is not enough for him. He wants 300 billion, right? So that's a direct correlation and a direct ipso facto cause and effect. You see it geographically. It's obvious.
So how the elites got so divorced from reality and why they can't understand the world around them, why they continue to fail. Well, he says, since the U.S. jettisoning of the gold standard in 1971, we've seen a profound shift in the nature of capitalism. Most corporate profits are now no longer derived from producing or even marketing anything, but in the manipulation of credit, debt, and regulated rents. As government and financial bureaucracies become so intimately intertwined, it's increasingly difficult to tell one from the other. Wealth and power, particularly the power to create money, that is credit, also become effectively the same thing. Despite this, politicians and media commentators systematically refuse to recognize these new realities. For instance, in public discourse, one must still speak of tax policy as if they need any of this, and that it's no longer about money creation, that there's actually some sort of wealth creation happening. That's
the whole idea of the monetarist school of economics, is that you are managing or piloting the economy through the magic of central bank interventions by either buying money or selling money or manipulating interest rates one way or another. The fact is that in America, like Saudi Arabia, the working class is not needed. In Saudi Arabia, the reason you have 5,000 princes and wide-scale poverty is because anytime you need money, you just pump more oil. In America, similarly, you don't need a working class in America. You don't need the $3 trillion in taxes they collect. The American worker is not only deplorable, but they are confiscatable. They are get rid of them, because all you do if you need more money is to print more money. America's printing press is like the Saudi oil well.
He points out that the commentators, the media commentators, the likes of Rachel Maddow, the fact that they fail to talk about this Cantillon effect, that they fail to tell you how so-called wealth is created in the U.S., that it ensures the means of credit creation can never be democratized, i.e., why not next time, why not do QE for the people? Of course, they're not going to talk about that on MSNBC. They're going to talk about it on RT. We've talked about it. Our guests like Steve Keen have talked about it. David Graeber has talked about it. But again, since 2008, governments have been pumping new money into the system, which, owing to the notorious Cantillon effect, has tended to accrue overwhelmingly to those who already hold financial assets and their technocratic allies and the professional managerial classes. In France, of course, these are precisely the Macronists. Members of these classes feel they are the embodiments of any possible universalism. Their conceptions of the universal being firmly rooted in the market, or increasingly that atrocious fusion of bureaucracy and market, which is the reigning ideology of what's called the political center. Fusion of the markets with the government, with the elite. That's corporatism, which then in the 1930s became fascism, a more violent thing. But here he points out that this universalism, that they do feel some sort of divine, like they are somehow better than everybody else because they're wealthier, and they believe their own propaganda that this is a meritocracy. And they continuously condemn the bottom, those the 99% who always pay through the Cantillon effect, that those bottom 99% are alt-right, they're deplorables, they're fascists, they're proto-fascists, they project all the stuff. They call them fascists, when in fact what the elites have is closer to what is the actual definition of fascism, minus the the actual brown shirting thuggery and kneecapping.
Right. It's kind of like Mussolini meets Jim Jones of Jonestown. If you can print $100 million and buy a Van Gogh and stick it on a wall and then get your photo on the cover of Fortune magazine, you are a god. Did you work even 5 minutes for that? No, not in the sense that you've worked. As long as we have interest rate apartheid, as long as we live in the Bantustans of this reserve out in the middle of the boonies, expendable, because our work and taxes are not needed, then we will be ever more consigned to the permanent underclass, and the forces of insurrection will continue to get stronger. The Gilets Jaunes movement is going global. Bankers are now rightfully seen as the enemy, full stop.
Well, certainly money creation will always basically make it impossible for you to climb up the ladder, and you become a national, in the media, you become the bad guy. You're the one that's painted as alt-right or deplorable or fascist. He says working people in this new centrist reality are increasingly denied any possibility of universalism since they literally cannot afford it. The ability to act out of concern for the planet, for instance, rather than exigencies of sheer survival, is now a direct side effect of forms of money creation and managerial distribution of rents. Anyone who is forced to think only of their own or their family's immediate material needs is seen as asserting a particular identity, and while certain identities might be condescendingly indulged, that of the white working class can only be a form of racism, they say.
Yeah, well, that's propaganda put out by the money printers. What the story here is that for 10 years we've been saying the story, and it's taken 10 years for people to realize it's not about a socialist revolution or a political conflict, and it's not an environmental threat, it's not an existential threat, it's a threat of central bankers and the people like Jamie Dimon. Jamie Dimon is the bin Laden of the 21st century.
I saw he recently actually was quoted as saying that he doesn't understand who all these people are that keep on following him around to public meetings and yelling at him from the audience.
That's exactly what bin Laden said when he was holed up in Pakistan next to a U.S. military base. Like, why is everyone following me? What's going on here? I just like to watch porno. Okay, well, we got to take a break, and when we come back, much more coming your way.